So I want to welcome everyone to the Exploring Climate Solutions webinar series. This series is brought to you by the Governor's Council on Climate Change. This past Thursday, Governor Malloy issued an executive order creating the Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3. They're tasked to examine the efficacy of existing policies and regulations designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and identify new strategies to meet the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. The council is composed of 15 members from state agencies, quasi-state agencies, business, and nonprofits. As a part of the council's exploratory process, the webinar series will explore innovative and successful climate change solutions across Connecticut and the nation. This series will provide first-hand accounts of high-profile municipal climate programs, climate initiatives in the corporate world, greenhouse gas reporting frameworks, statewide sustainability programs, and low-carbon fuel initiatives. Today is the first webinar of the series, and we're excited to have Megan Saunders, the Executive Director of the Stamford 2030 District, and Vincent Martinez, Director of Development Operations for the Architecture 2030, as our first speakers. Just a couple of notes. The slides in the webinar will be available for later viewing. They'll be archived on a deep website, and we'll send out a link to those that registered. So the Stamford 2030 District is an interdisciplinary public-private nonprofit collaborative working to create groundbreaking high-performance building district in downtown Stamford. The program aims to dramatically reduce energy and water consumption and reduce emissions from transportation while increasing competitiveness in the business environment and owners' return on their investment. We will be collecting questions from the audience via the GoToWebinar question box. At the end of the presentation, we'll read the questions aloud for Megan and Vincent to respond. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan and Vincent, and they'll walk through this innovative program.
Great, thank you, Carrie. This is Vincent Martinez. As I was introduced, I work for an organization called Architecture 2030, which is essentially the parent organization of the 2030 Districts initiatives, which Megan works for, and I'll get us started today and give you some background on our organization and the 2030 District model specifically and how it's being, and then Megan will talk about how it's being applied in Stamford. So our organization, Architecture 2030, was established as a nonprofit organization in 2006. We're essentially a research, nonpartisan nonprofit research organization. And we do research on the building sector and its impact on the built environment. We started by the architect Edward Mazzaria, who is an author and educator known globally. And he was really looking within his firm about how they could reduce energy consumption in their projects and had been doing that for decades. And he came to the conclusion after doing some research in the early 2000s that the building sector was really responsible for the majority of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, and he wanted to do something to change that. And so he formed Architecture 2030 as a nonprofit and started producing research and trying to get folks aware of this issue, specifically to his own profession of architects and engineers and planners, the design professionals. And what we ended up finding in the early 2000s in our research was essentially that the built environment, the building sector, consumes about half of all the energy and produces about half of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. on an annual basis. And you've probably heard of similar statistics from either the EPA, the Department of Energy, U.S. Green Building Council, that have really touted buildings as the major contributor, but most of those numbers are within the 40 to 43% of energy consumption range. And what they're giving you is essentially the operational energy of buildings, so heating, lighting, cooling, plug loads, hot water, the big ones. And those are about 40%, 43%. The rest of the pie that we make up to call it a building sector is really made up by the materials and the construction of those buildings. That rounds it off to about 50% of energy consumption. You can see through these charts that actually the large majority, whereas transportation is only about a quarter, and industry is about a quarter of our annual energy consumption here in the U.S. And because we have a fossil fuel-driven energy consumption, you can see that CO2 emissions really mimic that. What's also really interesting is that about 3/4 of electricity consumption goes directly to the built environment just to operate buildings. So we commonly think of transportation as being the larger issue, and it is in many cases, especially those in more rural environments or suburban environments. But buildings are on all the time. They're sort of a silent consumer. We don't see them necessarily at the tailpipe like we do with vehicles, but they're on all the time. They have to be heated and cooled, have lighting available so that we can function both at home and at the office. So this was the startling statistics that we came across in the early 2000s, published them in a number of magazines, including Metropolis magazine, a very well-respected design publication, and then launched a challenge to the profession, to all building sector folks, to say, we really need to get a handle on this consumption, and we need to look at where the climate scientists are saying we need to go in terms of reductions and do our part to achieve those carbon neutral goals. And so we launched what we called the 2030 Challenge, which was a set of performance goals for new construction and major renovation. It went from 50% reduction all the way to carbon neutral for new design and renovation. And then subsequently launched additional challenges for the planning community that looked at water reductions and transportation emission reductions as well. And those have been all very widely adopted by many, many building sector organizations on the new construction side, the American Institute of Architects, U.S. Conference of Mayors at a political level, U.S. Green Building Council is a supporter, and all of these organizations essentially have set that we need to head to carbon neutrality by the year 2030. And that's part of the goals of getting this pie under control. So another great organization structure that formed to meet this challenge is the 2030 Districts Initiative, which we'll talk about today. 2030 districts are essentially these private-public partnerships and downtown cores that work with a host of different professional organizations and ownership categories. So building owners, managers, developers, architects, engineers, community stakeholders, anybody that's really working in the built environment in the downtown core joins this. And this model started in Seattle about 5 years ago with a group of stakeholders there to meet their goals and take on that challenge locally. And since then, that model has spread across the country. The slide says that there's 10 established 2030 districts. We actually have a more recent one joined just currently just this last week. So there's actually 11 established 2030 districts and another 6 or 7 emerging districts that are following this model. And what they're doing is they're connected also within a network. So Architecture 2030 convenes this network of 2030 districts to share best practices, learn how to start up with this program, what have been the successes, where do we still have challenges, and learn collectively from each other. So when new initiatives are starting, it's not that they're starting from scratch without any connection to any of the other things that are happening. So it's essentially creating a shared language amongst communities so that not only can we share best practices between buildings locally, but cities regionally and cities internationally. So the 2030 districts, they follow 3 performance targets for buildings. They look at building energy use. So how much energy does it consume on a monthly and annual basis? That's the heating, lighting, cooling, plug loads. Essentially, they look at the utility bills and track that information. They also look at the water consumption of the building and have targets associated with reducing the water consumption from potable water, and that's again tracked at the utility bill level. And then looking at transportation emissions, and since there's some questions around, well, how does a building owner or a manager really affect transportation? Well, you can look at the commuting habits of the tenants in that building, and you can essentially quantify that in terms of its carbon input, depending on what mode of transportation they take. Do they bike to work? Do they walk? Do they take a single occupancy vehicle? Do they take public transit? Those are the types of information that we're collecting at each building level in every district and aggregating that up to create a collective performance of the district itself. The performance targets for the 2030 districts, I mentioned that Architecture 2030 put out the 2030 Challenge. That's really the basis of the performance targets for each of the 2030 districts. The original challenge is really listed on your right in terms of the new construction and major renovation goals. And those goals are for any new construction that's happening in the district boundary. And they're looking at energy reductions of now in 2015, a 70% reduction from its national median. So that means if there's a new school getting built in that district, what is the typical consumption of a school in that city? And then the target is a 70% reduction from that. So it's pretty significant, but a new construction, it's absolutely feasible and economic to make these reduction goals to 70%. And then it ratchets up every 5 years so that we get to carbon neutral new construction and major renovation. The water and transportation emission reduction goals are 50% for new construction. So again, you look at how much water does a typical school use in Connecticut, and then you would reduce that by 50% in the design. So that's the new construction goals. And that's been out for a while and widely adopted by about 53% of all design firms. So it's in many cases, it's part of the building code or transition to a building code. So this is really headed in that direction anyway, but the private sector can really step up and take a leadership position and move forward on these targets. On the left-hand side, you'll see the existing building goals for 2030 districts. And these are the same performance categories of energy, water, and transportation emissions. And it's an incremental improvement from 10% starting now in 2015. The next 5 years, we want to reduce to 20% of the reduction, all the way down to a 50% reduction by 2030. Now, the real interesting opportunity here is that these goals, while they are for existing buildings, are really for the district at large. It's an aggregated goal. It's saying if we add up everybody in the 2030 district, all of these buildings' performance, can we reduce their consumption by 50%? And so this, because it's an aggregated goal, it creates zero barrier to entry for somebody joining this initiative. So if they feel like they have a poor performing building, if they feel like maybe they can't reach that 50% goal by 2050, they can still join and they can still help the district to achieve the overall performance goal. And maybe they only get 20% down, while another building might actually get 70 or 80 or go all the way to net zero or carbon neutral, so they make up for each other. But the idea is that everybody can participate, we're all having a collective goal here, and that we can learn from each other. And so that building that is getting the 70 or 80% reduction can share their best practices about how they've been able to achieve that within their market. So these are private building owners and managers and developers. So they're actually achieving it on commercial real estate. And how do they share that practice with each other so that they can all move forward together? Essentially, they know they're competing on a number of different options for their market, but they shouldn't compete around efficiency and sustainability. So this is an opportunity for them to get there together with the collective goal. The different stakeholders that participate in 2030 districts, the primary ones are essentially the folks that own, manage, and develop buildings in the district. So those are property owners, managers, and developers. They are the majority of the leadership group as well. So each 2030 district has either a board of directors or an advisory board, and the majority of that is property owners, managers, and developers. It really is for the private sector, built by the private sector, and led by them. And then they're supported by service stakeholders, and these are the architects and the engineers and the energy service companies, the contractors, the folks that actually help those building owners to achieve those goals. And then, as well as it's supported by community stakeholders. So community stakeholders is everything from your city and county governments, your state government, but also your other types of community stakeholders like folks that are working on transportation efficiency or water efficiency, your nonprofit organizations or other NGOs, your industry organizations like the collective groups of the architects or the building owners. So everybody plays a role in this. And essentially the 2030 districts are just sort of framing the conversation around a shared set of performance targets and a shared language and a shared set of goals, whereas everybody can play in. The purpose of the district is not to reinvent any of the programs the community stakeholders are doing or to provide the services service stakeholders are doing. It's essentially to help them reach the property owners and managers to achieve the targets that we've set out to do. And it really has been a collective effort. There are, of those 10, 20, 30 districts that have been established, it's about 1,000 buildings that are participating, which are represented by about 250 different property owner, manager, developer groups. We have over 500 service stakeholders and community stakeholders participating within the network. So it's really a robust group of experts and professionals and community organizations that are headed in this direction. So what's the value proposition for joining a 2030 district if you're a property owner, a manager, or developer, if you're trying to talk to a property owner, manager, or developer about this model? Well, the idea is that there's no cost to join. So you're not asking for any money to start up this 2030 districts from those stakeholder groups. Rather, you're asking them to share their performance information. Data is power, essentially, and understanding, and education is part of that. And so you're collecting that information, and it's held anonymously, and it's only produced in aggregate. So you don't really you have to see and demonstrate all of that information publicly in terms of their utility bills. But what they get for that is essentially the 2030 district provides a concierge role or a general practitioner role. They have that network of community stakeholders and professional stakeholders, so they can easily put folks in touch with the appropriate contact if they need to make improvements. And then they also have access to leverage the collective buying power of the local district, but also the network provides that. So currently in the building sector, there is no general practitioner for you. So just like many of us can go to the doctor, get our heart rate checked, get our blood pressure checked, and the doctor can tell us if we are healthy and we're doing well, keep it up. They can tell us, well, you actually need to exercise a little bit more, eat a little bit better. And I use that analogy to say maybe the buildings actually has all its good, the assets are good, but it just needs to be operated better. So, and then the final one is, let's say that we actually do have something wrong with ourselves, with our heart or with our lungs. They, similar to a building, if there's something wrong with their building assets, their heating system or their cooling system or their lighting system, they can put them in touch with that cardiac surgeon, help them bring in a new equipment into the building to make it function. So that concierge service is really great. But the other piece is that those district entities aren't trying to sell anything. They're just trying to give you comparisons within the marketplace. Tell you, how are you comparing against the building across the street? And it's not just a one-to-one comparison in terms of they're an office building and you're an office building. They're a FA office building over 500,000 square feet. They also have a data server. They're operating 24/7 just like you are. So it's very much an apples-to-apples comparison, not a generalization about how you live in the marketplace. And that's very effective in creating change. If they can see that one of their neighbors in the same market class is achieving those performance goals, then they can say, oh, it's possible, I can learn from them, and I can actually make improvements. But it's also not pointing out the winners and losers. It's just saying what is possible, how can we help you achieve that? I mentioned that we're essentially aggregating the collective buying power of these 2030 districts, these building owners, and that's in that the icon there you see on the bottom right, exclusive incentives and discounts and programs. And so what we're seeing is that many companies want to have access to put their technologies or their services into these buildings to help them achieve their goals. And so we can ask for discounts or in certain cases free pilot projects for many of these building owners because we can act as a conduit to the market for these new technologies. So we've already seen that happen in LED lighting, for example, which we know that there's real energy savings there, and we can say essentially that the district's building owners can buy thousands and thousands of LED lights up front. And so that reduces the cost, just like you would go to a big bulk store like Costco or something, and therefore they are able to get significant rebates on those products. So it's a really exciting opportunity to leverage that collective buying power. And then the other is really looking at interesting incentive programs and financial programs to make these retrofits. We understand that sometimes it's difficult to make these retrofits on a case-by-case basis, and so looking for third-party financing, off-balance sheet financing for these building owners and to actually make the improvements in their building without affecting their bottom line and actually seeing a net benefit to those improvements over time through energy savings and value beyond cost savings, tenant retention, occupancy, improvements, and as asset value improvements. They can actually sell the building for more because it's valued higher. So those are all really great opportunities, and you can do that through a number of different programs, like through your tax bill, which I believe Megan will talk about briefly, through PACE financing, or even through on-bill repayment. And not all of those financing mechanisms are available everywhere, but it's about educating and providing the context for why that would be important as to make better business decisions on efficiency. So I'll turn it over now to Megan to talk about how this has been applied in Stamford and how they've actually implemented some of the value propositions to their building owners to make improvements over time, and how they've engaged with their community on both the professional service provider side and the community stakeholder side. Thanks.
Thanks, Vince. That was a great overview. Good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Saunders. Again, I'm the Executive Director of the Stamford 2030 District. And I'm happy to share with you this morning more about Stamford's approach to 2030. Currently, we're operating by bringing together our partners for regular meetings to share best practices, as Vince mentioned. I'll demonstrate some of the examples later, but currently our focus is on benchmarking both the energy and water use of our buildings to see how we're performing. One of the programs that we're actually able to create is a free benchmarking service and audit from our partners LegalWise and Stephen Winter Associates, who will actually sit down with our members and look at our data for free as a service for the district. And these are all examples of things that you can do without a formal structure, but we really feel that it takes the accountability of the group together and the time and the resources that we put into the district. One thing I did want to mention, though, is that there is something that communities can do right now to get started to see how their buildings are performing, and that is to benchmark their buildings. The Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which is a tool that we use, is actually a free tool online that you can access through the EPA. I can even provide a link afterwards. But there are step-by-step instructions on how to set up your property, and the tool then gives you a score which indicates how you compare to average buildings. So we're in the process of doing this right now for all of our members to see how we are performing. So Vince mentioned all of the larger cities that are participating in the 2030 program, and you may be wondering why Stamford. Stamford is definitely the smallest district and the first in New England. We're also the second largest energy market and fastest growing in New England, only second to Boston. We have high energy costs and aging infrastructure. But at the same time, our state has some really cutting-edge programs, including the CPA Program and renewable energy credits. And we really want to inspire building owners to take advantage of these programs and these tools to start meeting their sustainability goals. The Stamford 2030 District was actually started with the Connecticut Fund for the Environment and the Business Council of Fairfield County, who got together probably 2 years ago to start looking at different sustainability programs across the country that met both of their goals, which were to promote clean energy and make real reductions in our buildings, and also increase the economic competitiveness of our city. So they looked at different programs across the country, including eco-districts and others, and landed on 2030 because of the national network and clear metrics that the program provides. And I just wanted to note here also, the picture on the right is Stamford's Energy Improvement District boundary, which is the same boundary for Stamford 2030. Currently, we are concentrating on the 22 million square feet downtown and hope to make the program larger as it expands. So like many towns in southwest Connecticut, resiliency, or the ability to bounce back from storms, is a major issue. As a result, we've undertaken resiliency as a key focus, which is different from all of the other 2030 districts. Recently, we engaged with IBM and AECOM to work through the UN City Disaster Resilience Scorecard to help inform our strategy and generate a preliminary vulnerability analysis. Stamford was actually the first city in the U.S. To use the scorecard. We've also been very involved in the city's Energy Improvement District, which just solicited a contract to do deep energy audits and install a microgrid for 24/7 power for Government Center, our municipal building. And we'll be discussing other opportunities to integrate resiliency into our energy, water, and transportation goals moving forward. So we launched officially in October of last year, and just to give you a sense of some of the programs and topics we've discussed so far, I've listed them here. The PACE program, again, that we've mentioned. We've done webinars and programs on benchmarking and getting our buildings set up. We did an event to showcase some electric vehicle technology and even provide test drives for the members. And we're getting ready for an event this fall on microgrids and sub-metering, which the regulations just changed for that in Connecticut. So you can see that there's a variety of programs, and we're hoping for a full lineup for this fall and into next year. To give you some background on the funding, we are currently largely funded by foundations. However, we are working to create a self-sufficient model through business contributions and sponsorships in the long term. Right now we have 34 members, but we are hoping to grow. That for us is 8 million square feet of property that is committed. So if you're in Stamford and listening today, please feel free to get in touch with me to join the district. And if you'd like to see the full list of members, you can take a look at our website, which I'll have some information at the end that has the full list of all of our participants. So you may be wondering, what can your city do to get involved in this program or to try to meet these goals? One of the things that you can do is on our Resiliency initiative, we're happy to have others involved in our working groups on how to solve resiliency issues regionally and along the coast. This is something we know we can't do alone, so we have to have larger conversations about how to deal with storms and sea level rise as climate changes. Also, sharing best practices from your own city. I'm sure you all have great projects that your owners would be interested in hearing about or sharing their stories of sustainability, so just starting to have these conversations, I think, could get the ball rolling. Also, states or cities could require their buildings to benchmark and meet the 2030 goals. This creates accountability for the groups when using standards that are not just voluntary. Municipalities can reduce emissions from the commercial building sector if they adopt the right policies, and the business community takes these voluntary actions on their own, and I think that's really the strength of the 2030 program. I think some of this is probably happening on the state level, starting to look at energy use, but they could also commit to the 2030 goals as well. And finally, you could create your own 2030 district, and there's more information about that on the 2030 website. There are actually resources and toolkits available that show all the criteria and what you would need to do to officially sign the charter and become a 2030 district on the website www.2030districts.org. So that's it for me, and thank you again for having me. If you'd like to hear more, you can contact me directly. Also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook at Stamford 2030, or check out our website and sign up for our newsletter to watch our progress.
Megan and Vincent, thank you so much. That was really great. We do have questions that have come in. Folks can feel free to continue sending them in. So I'm going to actually turn it over to my colleague Jeff Howard to walk through the questions. So Megan and Vincent, we'll read them aloud, and we'll let you two determine who wants to take the questions. Does that sound good?
Sure. Great.
So I'm just now seeing the questions for the first time. One person asks, I'm going to take the liberty of focusing on the questions that are most directly germane to the presentation today. So one question that has come in regards benchmarking. What benchmarking tools do you use? Can you give some details on those things?
Sure. Megan, do you want to talk about what you're using, and then I'll talk about how the network is approaching it?
Sure. So there are a variety of options. The first one that we always present is the EPA Portfolio Manager that I mentioned. It is a free tool, so it's available to everyone online. We offer as a service to our members to set up a meeting one-on-one with all of our building owners to get their account set up. But as I also mentioned, we received a great offer that is exclusive to our members with a company called WeGoWise. And they actually have a software platform. It is a service you normally have to pay for, but it basically takes your utility data directly, uploads it to a website, and provides a snapshot for you of how your building is performing compared to your peers. There are a variety of other tools out there, but right now this is what we're offering to our members.
And to follow up on that, absolutely, the Energy Star Portfolio Manager is the default tool in which all the 2030 districts are using. And there's a number of reasons for that. It is a free tool. It is very comprehensive. It's a great way to collect the information from your utility bills or your utilities in certain cases directly. And it's offered by the Environmental Protection Agency through their Energy Star program, but it's also being one of the tools that is being asked for mandatory benchmarking disclosure in terms of ordinances around the country. So it's very much aligned with a lot of the policy initiatives that are happening around the country. The other tool that the 2030 District Network is pursuing very actively is a partnership with the Urban Land Institute, also known as ULI, and they have a program called Greenprint Center for Building Performance, which has an environmental management platform. So we think of it like Energy Star on steroids. It was actually developed by, it has direct connections into Energy Star, so you can still put all of your information into Portfolio Manager, and it links directly to this Greenprint platform, which was developed by property owners, managers, and developers, members of the Urban Land Institute, essentially, got together. They said they really want to look at this information in a more robust fashion, and they built this platform, essentially. And so the 2030 districts are starting to bring their data onto that Greenprint platform. We have the Seattle district and the Albuquerque district are starting that process for others to see how that platform will work. But essentially, there's over 6,000 buildings in that platform. It gives you a really great comparison about how you're doing, not only in your local market, but compared to other markets. And we really see that as the direction that all of the aggregated data will come together. They have the same kind of terms in terms of making sure that information remains private, that there's a central accounting and security associated with that. But we really see that Greenprint is where the districts are heading as a network in terms of moving from Energy Star and a free program it's got great ties to the local community and policy into Greenprint, which is a much more robust analysis platform.
Thank you. I'm trying to go first for the most fundamental questions. We have a question here regarding carbon neutrality. What do you mean when you use that phrase?
We mean carbon neutrality in terms of the operation of the building. So carbon neutrality can mean a lot of things and go all the way into the life cycle of building products and the construction practices, et cetera. In this case, we're just meaning its operation. So essentially, it is a very, very efficient building. In fact, we ask it to be about 80% more efficient than a typical building of its use and size and its location. And then it generates much of its own energy on site. It's not considered, we don't call it net zero energy. It doesn't have to generate all of its energy on site, but then also can get renewable energy off site from the grid. And so the idea is that throughout its operation, it doesn't consume any more carbon fossil fuel generated or electricity. So that's the idea of carbon neutrality when we reach that 2030 goal. Now we're not quite there yet. We still have about 15 years before that will be the main standard in terms of new construction and major renovation, but you're seeing a lot of other codes and policies heading in the direction, not quite in the carbon neutrality realm. They call it net zero energy, or in California, for example, has policy for net zero energy homes by 2020 and commercial buildings by 2030. It's very similar. We're talking about a high performance building, but that it uses carbon neutral renewable energy to power it.
Thank you, Vincent. Another question, maybe to toss your direction, Vincent, concerns the target size or other parameters of communities for the Architecture 2030 Districts program. Is there I take it, given that Stamford's quite small relative to others, that there's not a tight control or effort to target specific population size, but can you talk more about what kind of communities you're looking for in the program?
Absolutely. So the 2030 districts primarily right now are focusing on downtown cores of urban environments. There's a number of reasons for that, primarily because they're the most resource intensive in terms of a square footage basis. They use more energy per square foot, they use more water per square foot, they have a higher density of occupants and businesses, and they also have fewer main ownership categories. Essentially, one owner might own multiple buildings in a downtown core, or one manager might own or manage multiple buildings in a downtown core. So fewer fish in the pond, you can think of it that way, that are more resource intensive. The focus and the way that becomes a 2030 district is that we actually don't set a rigid requirement on the size of the city. And the only requirement that we actually set is in terms of the number of stakeholders participating. So we make a minimum requirement of 5 property owner, manager, developer entities that have to come together to participate and collectively commit to these goals. We don't want this to be a single developer-led effort. So one development is happening in an area of the city, one developer is really excited about this, and then they want to call themselves a 2030 district. That doesn't fit the collaborative nature and shared goal parameters. It's great, we want them to do that, but that won't qualify. We also don't want the city or county to lead this by themselves in terms of a citywide initiative or a countywide initiative where it's just that municipality trying to achieve that goal. So again, similar to the developer. We also don't want it to be a single institution like a campus. It really needs to be collective. So we set a minimum threshold of 5 owner-manager entities. So it could be the city, the county, the university, a new developer, and a couple of small building owners that come together around these. So it's that 5 building owners is the only criteria. We do ask them to generate a boundary, a physical boundary within their downtown core in which they try to look at the collective performance within that boundary. So they get together and they'll draw and see where there might be interest in stakeholders. They'll do communication and outreach to other building owners and managers to get them to all buy in that collective area. But the minimum requirement is 5 entities, not size of the buildings. They could own a 50,000 square foot building and be considered one of those 5. They could own an entire campus and manage an entire campus of 15 million square feet and be considered one entity.
Thank you. A follow-up question there. The idea that you're focusing on a district of contiguous properties, how does that figure into your thinking about what makes this program work? Why focus on contiguous properties as opposed to, say, dispersed properties within a municipal boundary participating in a program? Where's the district concept come into this, into your thinking here?
Right, great question. There are a number of reasons why we think a district approach can be very valuable in this setting. One is just to sort of, let's just talk about the technical opportunities. You can have district scale systems, essentially. So shared resources between ownerships, shared projects between owners. So think of for a stormwater retention kind of project where you can actually have a shared bioswale maybe in between properties. In terms of energy, it could be a district energy system in which there is a distributed plant that generates energy, and there's an hydronic loop that sends energy between buildings. So there might be an office building that produces too much heat during the day, and then that would send it into the heat loop and send it to a building that needs that heat during the day. So there's shared efficiencies of scale at a district level, but there's also a shared efficiency in terms of understanding a core entity and looking at performance. So when you look at performance within a downtown core and you're comparing 2 different buildings, that's very similar in terms of its market and understanding between those 2 buildings. When you're comparing an office building downtown and an office building in a suburban area, they're very different markets still. So the comparison doesn't quite translate in terms of the same type of buildings in the same market. So that's really important to the district boundary. And then the other is that you're actually creating this sort of awareness of this entity of the city. The city core is actually achieving a certain goal together, and they can then be compared to other cities, or it can help with an economic development opportunity. So knowing that Stamford, for example, has a 2030 district, their member buildings are achieving these performance goals, that can be very interesting to a business entity or a company that wants to move into a downtown core that knows that they're going to have low operating expenses. And so it doesn't matter which building within that downtown core they lease. They could lease multiple buildings, but they know that that is a beacon for resource efficiency. So it's really highlighting the city in that downtown core as a leader. So those are the 3 different reasons why the district approach really takes on a life of its own as opposed to just a general overarching program. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be targeting these targets on an overarching program goal. It doesn't mean it absolutely should be complemented by policy that looks at things in terms of more of a regional or a city or a county scale. But those are the real keys as why a physical district downtown makes sense.
Thank you. Megan, as you put your program together in Stamford, how are you thinking about the possibility of what, maybe you already said, if you would repeat please, what proportion of the properties within your district are currently engaged in this actively, And what happens if you don't have enough doing that? How does that affect the program, and what pressure does that put on those who are participating to carry more of the load? How do you think about those questions?
Sure. Currently we have about 8 million square feet committed to the program, which is a little bit over 1/3 of the downtown district. So again, we are definitely trying to grow that number. We felt like it was very important from the beginning. I actually came on board in April of last year, and we felt like it was really important to get really a critical mass and some of the major building owners to commit to the challenge before we officially made our announcement about being a 2030 district. So I would say definitely it's important to start looking at who are the building owners who are already doing these things, but also who are the critical building owners that you need to really create that mass and get the district moving to show some progress.
We've also had a question regarding funding. Can you tell us more about how Architecture 2030 is funded and whether each district receives financial support? Start with Stamford, if you would, Megan, on that front.
Sure, and I probably will let Vince speak to this a little bit too, but every district is actually funded independently. So the Stamford district was first funded by the Kresge Foundation, who is a national foundation, and they've provided some seed funding for us to really get off the ground and actually continued to work with us as the district moves forward. We've looked at other funding opportunities. We just won a national award, the Partners for Places, with a local grant, the Tremaine Foundation, as well as the John Merck Fund. So I mentioned earlier that currently most of our funding does come from foundations, but we do see a long-term goal of becoming a self-sufficient organization and probably our own 501c3 as we ramp up on business support and sponsorship from the community.
And in terms of an Architecture 2030 perspective, our organization is funded almost exclusively through philanthropy, through grants, for the past almost 10 years. Because we consider ourselves more of a research organization and a think tank, we don't have any corporate sponsors, which many of the 2030 districts do. So that's how we're funded. And we provide technical support and assistance to the 2030 districts as a network, so we convene that network. There's no financial contribution from Architecture 2030 currently to the individual districts, although we are in the process of trying to develop a matching fund that would help incentivize local giving and funding for local districts that would be matched by a national fund. So we're in the process of developing that. The individual districts are funded in a number of ways. As Megan alluded to, philanthropy and grants is usually the typical one in terms of getting these organizations going. Some 2030 districts are housed within very well-established organizations that have a diverse set of funding opportunities as well, so they can channel existing funds into the district initiative. The majority of the ways the districts are funded, though, is through grants. The second would be sponsorship. So this is typically through the service providers that want to be well-known and recognized within those local districts to those that they would like to do business with the property owners. So these are usually your energy efficiency companies, your ESCOs, your contractors, your architects and engineering firms that are sponsoring the district initiative. And so they might give different amounts of contribution to either sponsor the district at a whole, or individual events as well. And so that's a great opportunity to raise funding for the district initiative, and it really is a good engagement tactic with the professional service providers as well. There's a couple other financial models that are being explored by individual districts. Some receive funding from their local regional efficiency office, also known as a RIO. So, for example, up in Connecticut, it would be the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership. And these are organizations that are typically funded by utility programs to help with efficiency. And so that can be an option in the Texas districts, for example, in San Antonio and Dallas. They have some funding associated through grants, but it goes through their regional efficiency office. So they see the 2030 district as a great conduit to the market, to the commercial real estate market for their programs and other initiatives. So it makes sense to fund that initiative. The others can be more of a fee-for-service approach in which the district is providing a service to, for example, the city government. The city might have a program in which they want to do outreach to the commercial real estate market, and rather than hiring somebody and going out and knocking door to door, the 2030 district already has the eyes and ears of these members that they want to get into this program, and so they can provide a service for the city, for example, to administer that program, as long as it's aligned with the 2030 district goals. So that fee-for-service component is evolving, and there's actually, we think, about 10 different value propositions to either the members themselves, to the city, to the county, to the utilities, that the districts can really play in helping them to achieve all of their goals and their mission. So that fee-for-service is a growing portion of the financial stability of districts.
Thank you. Another question here. What role can tenants play in achieving the goals of the district as opposed to property owners and property managers?
Megan, would you like to say if you've worked out with any tenants in Stamford, and I can give a broader perspective?
Sure. We definitely do have tenants participating in the program, and I would say the first thing is if they are able to meter their buildings and look at their own individual energy and water use, that's definitely helpful. And if not, and they still want to participate, it is a way to start that conversation with their building owners on being able to collect that data. One of the things that we've been talking about, and this is a conversation that's happening on the national level, is the idea of green leases where building owners can make upgrades in the building where normally the tenants receive the benefit, but really to get rid of that split incentive issue by changing around leasing terms when building owners are doing upgrades. So there are a variety of ways that the tenants can definitely benefit from programs like this, even in just looking at their operations. And we're providing some training. I didn't mention it, but one of the things that we're looking at is a program for facility managers and building operators to more efficiently operate their buildings. And so that's one way that they could participate.
And I'll just add from a network perspective that we have a program now that we've worked with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. It's funded by the Department of Energy to focus on small commercial building retrofits. And what we found in the first couple years of this pilot is that the large majority of the decisions on the small commercial level are actually made by the tenant or for the tenant. So actually engaging with those tenants, whether that's a retailer or a restaurateur, about looking at upgrades and saving them money in terms of their operational costs. You know, a lot of these folks run on slim budgets and overhead, and to help them reduce their consumption and their energy bills really helps them achieve their mission, but you have to reach them at the right time, and those are the folks that really make the decisions in the small commercial market as the tenant. And I think Megan's point about being able to submeter your spaces at a larger building level for each tenant, you can definitely have a tenant participate. So in some of the districts are looking at creating a whole different stakeholder category or membership category for tenants. And then Energy Star and the EPA has also built a Tenant Star program in which they're actually engaging with tenants and helping them to track their performance. And so the districts are also sharing that information with tenants about how they can make improvements in their building. And the last point I'll make is that the operational side and user engagement, tenant engagement side, is absolutely critical to achieve some of these larger goals. You can see savings with just tenant engagement programs of 15-20% energy savings, just by getting the tenants to understand that their use of the space really does affect consumption. So everything from making sure you turn off the lights to having your janitorial staff come in during the day instead of at night, so they don't have all the lights on and the building heating up just to let the janitors clean the space. So a lot of that tenant engagement opportunity, and even sort of little mini competitions between floors or between tenants, really helps drive efficiency down. So if one business is trying to save more energy over a week than another business, and they get rewarded for that, that can be a really great motivator. So engaging the tenants is absolutely critical. Even if you have the best building in terms of its assets, you have great operational team, team and facilities managers, the tenants can decide to drastically change the performance of that building. So connecting with them is critical.
Thank you. Megan, climate change raises some serious threats for communities along Connecticut's shoreline. How has Stamford 2030 grappled with, or how is it intending to grapple with the effects of climate change, especially shoreline-related effects of climate change? How is that factoring into your design of the program?
Great question. So I mentioned that we are the first district to take resiliency, really trying to tackle some of those issues as one of our goals. So I mentioned as a first step, we created this vulnerability assessment of the city to really look at what are the parts of our community that need to be focused on. So we hear a lot of the times that people feel like their buildings themselves are resilient and maybe their supply chains are resilient, but the community as a whole, if that's not resilient, then they can't get people in and out of their buildings and to and from work. If a major storm happens and a sea level rises. So we are looking at this holistically, and out of that preliminary assessment, one of the things that's really shown up as a key focus area is looking at stormwater and how it relates to small flooding incidents within town. So we've actually just recently applied for a funding opportunity with NOAA to research a little bit more about what can be done so that the town can be more proactive and we can share best practices on what individual building owners can do. And that would be everything from installing rain gardens and looking at other green infrastructure techniques that people can use to reduce runoff and slow the runoff from their sites. We're also, as I mentioned, looking at the opportunity that the city has provided through the Energy Improvement District, which is a microgrid, which currently they're only using for public buildings, but we believe that there is great opportunity for the private sector to also engage in this type of program where they would actually be able to take their buildings offline or off the grid so that if a storm comes and the power does get shut down, that they're still able to operate at least their critical facilities when that happens. So spreading the word on that and looking into opportunities about how the private sector can get involved.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. A more narrow question here. Megan, you mentioned the CPA program here in Connecticut. Does Stamford 2030 partner with Green Bank in any way?
We do, actually, and I probably should have mentioned that. We do some outreach with the CPA program in Connecticut. One of my slides, I mentioned some of the programs that we've done, and actually this past spring, we did 2 focused events with CPACE where they actually presented to our members on how the program can work, specifically for 2 of our member types. One of our events focused on nonprofits in the faith community, and the other was for multi-family housing. And so we do work with them to talk about how that program, which has been very successful, can work for our building owners and the savings that they're able to achieve and how they're able to finance using their property tax bill.
Thank you. We have time for one more quick question and quick response. Are universities and colleges involved in the 2030 district in any way? And Vincent, are they part of the picture nationally?
I can answer that for Stanford's perspective. Currently, we have Fairfield University, which is actually outside of our boundary, but they are acting as a professional partner for the district and providing some of their technical leadership from the business school and looking at some of the financing opportunities for solar and other technologies. We're definitely looking into getting some more of the university crowd. There are some small campuses in downtown Stamford that we'd love to get involved, but there's definitely opportunity for them.
And in terms of the network level, the large majority of the other 2030 districts do have very strong participation from a host of their universities. Seattle University in Seattle, for example, Point Park University, Carnegie Mellon, Penn in Pittsburgh, Cleveland State University in Cleveland. All of those are active participants in the 2030 districts, University of New Mexico and Albuquerque. The part of what we're trying to do also is to talk with the universities and understand how the 2030 districts can help meet their other goals, whether that's the President's Climate Commitment Goal or their goals through the ASHE STAR system that they have currently on sustainability. So rather than, again, give them another set of criteria and another program, obviously the goals of energy and water and transportation emissions are tied into every sustainability program. So how does it work within what the universities are already doing and structured and help benefit them to achieve those goals? So really aligning it with their existing programs is key in that participation, but we have strong leadership and participation in all the 2030 districts from an academic and university perspective.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful hearing both of you talk about your program, and we had a lot of time for questions, which I think helped enlighten people beyond your presentation. So thank you again for being our first webinar. I think it went mostly successful on our end, technical wise. We will post this for those of you who didn't that want to send it around to others. And we are planning on having more programs to present in the coming weeks, and we'll send out our next announcement hopefully within the next week. So thank you to participants for participating, and again, thank you to our speakers.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.
Thank you.